All right, hello everyone. Hope everyone enjoyed their lunch, feel good and ready to go. I hope this is a topic that you are interested in, and to be honest with you, I was a little fearful that nobody would come, but I'm really glad to see some of your faces here. Some of you have already met yesterday. So thank you so much for being here to hear my talk. It's really nice to see you. So this presentation is actually a dream of mine for quite some time, many years. I've been interested in psychedelics and my experience, what I've just experienced myself. So this is my dream, to spread more about this experience and deaf individuals in this community. So I'm ready for the next slide. So I have 4 parts to my presentation. Hopefully I'll have time to go through all of them. Fingers crossed, we'll see. Next slide. All right, a few things about myself. I'll go to the next slide. I'll show you some pictures of me when I was a kid. So when you look at these pictures, do you just see a deaf girl? Some people might say yes, some people might say no. Yes, I am deaf, but we can do anything another person can do. So when I say I'm deaf, people may only see that and miss other parts of my identity. I am more than just a deaf person, a person with hearing loss. So these pictures identify other parts of myself. So a little bit about my professional background. I'm a licensed psychologist, and I've been licensed since 2013. I went to Laval University, and that's in the province of Quebec, in the eastern part of Canada. That's where I reside. Most everyone there speaks French. So French is my first language. I learned English and LSQ, which is the sign language in Quebec. And American Sign Language is my 4th language. That's what I'm presenting to you in today. And so I've worked in different settings and rehab centers, things like that. Currently, I do have a private clinic, and I work alone. I do rent my own office. And my clients are people who are not deaf, people who are hard of hearing and deaf. I see anyone. We do one-on-one in-person or virtual therapy. And I did recently have some training in harm reduction for psychedelics. So I feel like this is just the beginning for me, the first training in this field, so I am seeking more training in the future on the topic of psychedelics. Prior to that, I feel like I was in the closet about my own psychedelic goals. I've done a lot of reading and personal research, but now I feel ready to step out, and I feel like it's safe to talk about. Even though I do have a license, of course I don't want to lose that. There's a lot of fear, but I've made the decision to move forward and talk openly about my pursuit and goals. So ready for the next slide? So the second part of my talk, what you need to know about deafness. Next slide. So what's important to know about the deaf community there are 3 groups, more or less. Degree of hearing loss. It's mild to profound deafness. There's a spectrum there. It's also, you can classify someone at the age of onset when they lost their hearing. They may have been born deaf, or born and was able to hear and learn some language, and then maybe lost their hearing as later in life, at any point. It can happen at any point in life. And another way to classify people with hearing loss is that they have a cultural and linguistic connection or identity. They feel a part of the deaf community, or maybe they're more closer to functioning like a hearing person and feel more close to the hearing world. Next slide. So there are some key terms or topics that are important, that are very common in the deaf community and deaf world. It's not just deaf and hard of hearing. There is people who have vision and hearing loss called deafblind. So you see 4 categories up there. I've mentioned 2. So the first is hearing, and that's what we call you, who are in the audience. You can hear. You use spoken language to communicate your hearing. And we call you hearing because you are the majority in our community. And that's how we've chosen to label you. It's opposite of our experience. Just like you think about a white dominant culture, that's the same concept, is hearing as the most dominant. And then the next term is deaf. And that's very common with people who are born deaf, have grown up using a signed language, and they feel a sense of belonging in the deaf community. And sign language is their primary mode of communication. It's important to remember there's culture, art, and different businesses. There's ways of expressing ourselves in sign language so that it is a part of the community. It's very beautiful and vibrant and rich. Also, when it comes to written English, it is often a deaf person's second language. Sign language is their first. So you're exposed to visual language every day, not so much written English, so it's often a challenge in teaching English. So when you meet a deaf person, their grammar is going to be different. Their English grammar is different than American Sign Language. So it is usually a deaf person's second language. So people may have mastery of English, but there's different levels when it comes to that. Some people have very basic English because it's their second language. And then we come to hard of hearing. That term is probably used very common with someone who has hearing loss, but not a profound loss, more moderate. Hard of hearing people typically use a hearing aid or a cochlear implant. I use a cochlear implant. You're able to hear environmental sounds and people speaking, but I'm not able to hear everything myself. So hard of hearing typically do rely on speech to communicate. They may use their voice themselves. Some hard of hearing people may use sign language, but prefer to use their voice to express themselves. Deaf individuals generally use sign language, may use their voice, but typically prefer sign language only. That's a way to differentiate the two communities. And the last one is deafblind individuals. That's someone who has a dual sensory loss of vision and hearing loss at the same time. So there are different levels of both of those sensory losses. So everybody's different. And a few years ago, the deafblind community, they do use tactile sign language, and they've invented another touch communication system called ProTactile, but I'm not going to go into that right now. Just so you know that these communities are alive and in existence right now. Next slide. So something I failed to mention, you see this term in red, and deaf, blind, hard of hearing, I forgot to mention that, but that acronym kind of encases the whole community. And when I say deaf, in this presentation, I'm talking about all three, deaf, blind, and hard of hearing. And each different community, deaf, blind, hard of hearing, have unique needs. But when I say deaf, that's just what I'm referring to as that whole community. So you all are familiar with the term racism. So we have a term in our community called audism, which is oppression or discrimination based on someone's ability to hear or behave in the manner of one who hears. So they think about someone who can hear and speak has greater privilege and ability than someone who is deaf. And we do experience oppression in the deaf community. You see some examples up here. I probably don't have time to go into all of them, but I would recommend kind of do some research yourself of the experience of audism, what it looks like. Next slide. So both of these concepts are important in relation to therapy. If you are a therapist who can hear, it's important to be careful with these two concepts. And if you're a deaf therapist too, it's important to be mindful of these as well. So there is a hearing privilege and power. There's power dynamics there. So as a hearing person, you have greater privilege over someone who has hearing loss. You have access to everything. There are no communication barriers in your day-to-day life. And so there's a position of power for those who can hear over deafness. So it's important to consider the relationship and how that may impact the therapeutic relationship. In my practice, or just myself, I can speak. So I do have some privilege there because I can use my voice. I don't have the barriers that someone who's unable to use their voice to communicate. So that definitely influences my experience and my relation with my deaf clients. So if you can hear, you have access to all kinds of communication. It's very easy for you. Deaf people face a lot of barriers and have to do a lot more work to access that same information. And there's structural ableism as well. There's the audism that I talked about. And then there's you're able-bodied. So able-bodied individuals often oppress people with disabilities. That's ableism. And the system is made for people who do not have disabilities, for people who can hear and don't have hearing loss. So that influences deaf individuals' lives and has barriers to access health care. There's also the medical model related to people with disabilities, and that's a pathology. So be careful that you don't want to fix the person's hearing loss. Some deaf people are against cochlear implants or hearing aids, but there are some positive views there, but people think, why do you want to fix my hearing loss? I'm proud to be a deaf person. I'm trying to pay attention to time. Oh my goodness, I'll try to rush here. Just briefly touch on the savior complex. That means, suppose I'm a person who can hear, I think, oh, these poor deaf people, I want to save them. They have such a terrible life. And that's not true. Deaf individuals know what they need. They have rights. They're able to empower themselves and get what they need. And we should empower them to move forward. We're not trying to save them. And if you want to save deaf people, just ask yourself, why are you doing that? It's important to consider your motivations for your own self and for your clients. So I'll try to jump ahead a little bit.
Now I want to talk about some unique challenges and the barriers that exist. These challenges stem from living in a hearing-centric world. Next slide, please. So this is a picture of the mental health access that exists for these different populations. You can see the backpack for deaf people is huge and the door is tiny. Whereas for hearing people, it's the opposite. They have a small backpack and the door to access mental health is huge. Next slide. Actually, let's continue in the interest of time. Next slide. So obstacles to psychedelic assisted therapeutic access or therapy access. Deaf people often experience things like no research being done about them or with them. None at all. I mean, there's one article that exists about disabled people in general, but none about deaf people specifically. And then no official psychedelic protocol exists whatsoever. And then psychedelic assistive technology, I'm going to say PAT going forward. We would, to do that, a deaf person needs to work one-on-one with someone and practice, which doesn't make sense. Wouldn't make sense for them to practice with a hearing person. They would have to do it with a deaf person, or at least someone who can sign. It's also, these PAT trainings are very expensive when working this population, and very few therapists are deaf. There's not very many of them. It's a lot harder for myself as a therapist to find a colleague to even work with. In fact, I'm the only licensed psychologist in my province who is deaf. Next slide, please. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So my personal experience, I have gone to 2 ayahuasca retreats myself, one in 2011 and the next one in 2016, and they were completely different contexts. The first one occurred in a Mayoka, which had many beds available, a Maloka nearby. And I was the only deaf person in that group. Everyone else was hearing. There was a deaf practitioner there. And then in 2016, it was completely different. This one was deep in the jungle, in the rainforest, and it was a fully deaf group. All the participants were deaf, which was a great experience for me to have had. And with both of those experiences, they were quite different, like I said, but they had said that they were both deaf-friendly, and both of them are not in existence anymore. So access to these types of experiences are very difficult, even with ayahuasca centers. Next slide. So pros and cons. I think I'll actually go forward with the slides because I wanted to jump forward to recommendations. So next slide. Yes, how to include a deaf participant. Perfect. So I wanted to really emphasize this slide and the previous one, which says nothing about us without us. So if you don't want to make mistakes with this population, you really just have to include them. Ask the experts, because they're the experts of what they need. You absolutely have to bring them to the table. So create a committee with deaf, deafblind, or hard of hearing people to set up an accessible research protocol. That's a very good idea. To test a protocol, to do a pilot. Next slide, please. And then in therapy settings, If you have a therapeutical, you're probably used to seeing people in ayahuasca retreats with a blindfold on, with a headset on, etc. And I don't think those things work with this population. You can't use a blindfold because deaf people communicate visually. And you know, maybe some can access auditory information, but some cannot. So you have to figure out other ways to interact, how to communicate preferences and needs, and ask the deaf person what their preferences and needs are when it comes to touch, communication, etc. And then in terms of therapeutic dyads, often there are two people in a therapeutic setting like this, and if possible, that's great. If it's not, because you know there are so few of us, unfortunately, you may have to just have one therapist and not a dyad. But if you can have two, that's really the best practice. You could have, or possibly you could have a deaf and hearing therapist work together. Doesn't matter whether they're male or female, but that way you can talk about any issues that come up with hearing people and deaf people that might show up in this context. And then if you can have both deaf, one male, one female, that's the absolute best, just like you would do with hearing people. All right, next slide, please. Actually, if you could go back a slide. No, I'm good. All right. All right, now I wanted to talk about including deaf people in ayahuasca retreats. I really want to emphasize screening. It is of the utmost importance. It is vital that we understand that deaf people are individuals. They're very different, and you really have to sometimes refer someone to therapy before they're able to participate in an ayahuasca retreat. So that really needs to be screened first. And if you don't know how to screen this population, it's important to have a deaf mental health professional involved to help you evaluate the client and see what would be the best approach for them. And I also want to say that if you can, it's really wonderful to have an all-deaf group or have at least 2 deaf people in a group, not just a deaf person alone. And that way, a deaf person always has a support system there, someone who knows their language. For example, if I'm the only deaf person, I feel disconnected from everyone else in the group. So 2 minimum, but preferably the whole group deaf. And then if you have access to a deaf professional training in psychedelics, that's the absolute best, especially somebody, an expert who is deaf and trained in psychedelics themselves. If you can't, then you can have somebody who is hearing with a good understanding of sign language. That would be the next best thing. And then if that's not possible either, then an interpreter who knows sign language is as a last resort, just for the preparation and integration work. Because at least there is some access there to audio information, etc. And then it's really important, as much as possible, for the hearing staff to know some sign language, so they can communicate or perhaps use a communication board or gesture. Just any visual communication is a help, so that the deaf people feel more included and can be spoken to directly. Next slide. Ayahuasca ceremonies. It's important to discuss touch and consent before the first ceremony. and also to give a lot of information about what to expect with ayahuasca, so that the deaf people can feel more comfortable and that just less panicked, and that there's less of a risk of them having to leave. They know basics in terms of ceremony and rules, etc. It's really important to explain all that beforehand. And then the shaman themselves should be aware of the deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing communities' communication needs. For example, having a light on their forehead so that there's at least some visual access to what's going on can really affect people. People can be really sensitive to light when they're drinking ayahuasca, so sometimes a red light is preferable. And then the shaman, if they're singing a caros, if the deaf participants have hearing aids or cochlear implants, they may be able to be guided by these songs, but if they don't have either of these, then they don't have access and they may feel quite left out, and that they don't belong, that they're not being guided, that they're not connected to the shaman. So if you can add drumming in these situations, that drumming will help the deaf participant feel less alone. And for participants of the ayahuasca ceremonies who have hearing loss, if they can incorporate smell, that would be great as well. Or, supportive smells like agua de Florida or rose water, etc. Next slide. If you're deep in the jungle and quite isolated, and there's like a small house where one or two people sleep, a tabo, deep in the jungle, for a deaf person who is alone, they might feel a lot of apprehension, because it's especially if the staff are quite far away. So you have to figure out how to communicate so that the deaf person doesn't feel overly isolated. Figure out ways to have two-way communication. Maybe some type of a light system, or just something that you come up with together. Because if you use something like an air horn, you don't know, like a deaf person doesn't know if a hearing person has heard that, and that might really make them feel uncomfortable and nervous until they actually see that someone is responding to the air horn. So it's really great if you can have something that's two ways, so that the deaf person knows that the message was received. And then it's important to tell deaf people that having cochlear implants or hearing aids in a humid jungle environment may cause issues with their equipment. And that maybe they're not the best thing to use in ceremony, or for them to prepare for what to do if their equipment does break. Next slide. All right, so here we are. Any questions from you in the audience? I'm so glad that you've heard my talk and happy to answer any questions. And I do want to really thank Bia for her being so open-minded in inviting me to even give this talk here. And having me here with my interpreters. It's the first time having a deaf person welcomed this way. It's a journey for her and her team as well. So a huge thank you to Bia and their team. And I'm so thrilled to see you all here. Thank you all so much.
If there are any questions, I see a hand on the left side, it looks like. So we'll figure this out. We'll have someone come up on stage so the question can be filmed. Okay.
I started to talk to you yesterday in group, but then our group was ended. And I was interested in and you had said a little bit about your own experience hearing the Icaros, but I wondered about the effect, if people felt the Icaros, if they couldn't hear them, did they still have an experience, like a strong experience of purging or something like that?
Good question. Thank you for asking. Okay. There were some deaf individuals that did say they felt the effects, even without being able to hear, so that didn't seem to be a concern. It's more about the energy, the indigenous shaman's energy, the vibrations that are coming across. Your body can feel that, so you don't necessarily need to be able to hear. I felt fortunate that I had both experiences. I did keep my cochlear implant on, so I could hear the Icaros. And there was a time I was having an issue with the equipment. I did take it off for a ceremony. It was a different experience. So I kind of understood the added dimension of being able to hear the Icaros. It was missing for me when I took the implant off. So if there's a deaf individual who could experience both ways, that's great. If they're unable to, maybe that's where you could add the drumming so they can feel the vibrations a little bit more and feel more in relation with the experience if they're unable to hear it. So that would be my recommendation for something to try. Of course, talk with the deaf person, see what their preference are. Do they want some drumming? And then you can set up something in advance for them. I think there is a question on the left side.
If y'all could come down to ask the question, since it's being filmed, that would be great. Unless you are unable to, I can come to you. No, you can just stand right here. Perfect. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. So I am a community organizer, and I am wanting to create more access for deaf people in our community to access psychedelic community. And one of the questions that I have is, I feel like there is the issue of like paying for an interpreter and then being worried that no one would show up and not getting access to the deaf community. And so I'm kind of just curious, like as a community organizer, how can I create more access for deaf people to be able to come to speaker series and things like that?
Thank you for this question. This is a very important topic to discuss. So really, as a deaf person in the deaf community, we're unfortunately used to not having access. We just assume there will be no access. I'm not going to bother. We often just don't even try. Sometimes you can request interpreters, but if you're setting up an event and you have interpreters, you can add that in the advertising. A deaf individual may themselves request interpreters, but it's best to just provide it no matter what, even if a deaf individual is not able to come. But you could add the cost of interpreting into your budget moving forward. It doesn't matter if a deaf person is able to attend or not, but you've established that expectation that your events will be accessible moving forward. So you are showing that you are accountable for providing accessibility to those with disabilities, and that's your goal. So I would recommend maybe reach out to any local deaf organizations where you're based, any national organizations even. Just reach out to them. You might be able to find them on Facebook, and that's where you could advertise your events. Even you can find more deaf individuals that way instead of just advertising in the regular way that you would. So you'll have to seek out deaf communities to share your advertising to get the word out. Perhaps they will find it if they're seeking that out themselves, a deaf individual who's looking for a psychedelic community might find that, but most deaf individuals may just, if they're not interested in the topic, they may miss it in your advertising. So I hope I'm answered your question clearly.
Thank you very much so.
I also want to make a comment. Thank you for teaching.
Go ahead.
I also want to make a comment. Thank you for your openness and for teaching us. It has been interesting to feel humbled and ignorant. For example, she told us it's not just about translating her presentation, but her experience during the conference. How would she follow all the sessions? So she had people coming with her, helping her understand and follow everything. As a cultural anthropologist, I love the topic of languages and culture and communication, and found an interesting parallel with the situation of Mexicans, Brazilians, and indigenous people in the conference. Because it's not just translating during their panels, but how are they going to follow the whole conference? And what kind of true dialogue are we creating if they only can speak but not understand all the rest? And how much more expensive that is, and how much more complex that is, and how much more interesting that is, and how much that makes us all really closer to each other. It's my sincere prayer that from now on, all psychedelic conferences have translation. And thank you guys for doing it for free.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, in response to that, I wanted to say that I am humbled as well and grateful for these interpreters coming here, even though they're not being paid. Sometimes the first time you do something, you have to bend the rules just to open the door, open the way, and make a path for something new like this. So I'm really humbled and grateful. Without the interpreters, this would not be happening. And yeah, having to shadow me, I mean, I didn't ask them to. They did this out of the goodness of their heart. And so yes, sometimes you can have an interpreter just for a talk, but then you miss all the incidental conversations that happen before and after. And it's not easy for me to communicate without interpreters because English is not my first language, and there's also a lot of extraneous noise going on that's masking the words that are being spoken. It's really hard, so it's just so much better for me to connect with you all with interpreters. So thank you, interpreters, and thank you, everyone else. Thank you, Bia. Thank you so much.
We have time for 1 or 2 more questions, depending.
Thank you.
Okay.
I wanted to go back to the drumming that you mentioned. Oh, that's right. Yeah, no problem. Cool. I wanted to go back to the drumming that you mentioned. I had a friend who is deaf, and they told me they don't like mushrooms because it's, they're already deaf, and then their vision was obstructed because of the visuals, and it was overwhelming, and that they never wanted to do it again. And so I'm curious, in the context of, your experience and maybe people that you know who are also deaf who've had experiences with psychedelics, what has helped to ground them in those challenging moments? Was there anything specifically covered maybe even before they went to ceremony? And I'm just really curious to learn about how grounding would work in that context for deaf people.
Great question. Thanks for your question. Really good question. Let me see here. You know, drumming is, so I have some personal experience with drumming and psychedelics as well. So I can base my response on that and say that yes, the use of that modality is supportive. But at the same time, this is just my experience. It's not something that I know is shared with everyone else. It's just my lived experience as a deaf person. I know that drumming benefits me because I know that these Icaros really affect my experience. They guide me, they benefit me. And so I want to find ways to make music more accessible, and one way has been drumming. So that being said, I'm not sure if I answered your question. I think maybe I might have missed part of your question. Oh, the visual part. Thank you so much. The interpreter clued me in. Okay, right, you were saying this deaf person and their experience with mushrooms and the visual thing. So it depends on the dose, right? If it's a really large dose, then yes, there can be some effects visually. And in that case, you can use more tactile solutions or write things on a board or have pictures ready beforehand to help this deaf person communicate if they need to do something like go to the bathroom, for example. And yeah, or just maybe some very basic signs can be set up and prepared before the ceremony. Whereas if it's a low dose, then the effect visually is not as great, and there may not be those complications. Thank you again for your question. All
We have
right.
time for one more question.
Okay. I'm going to speak and not sign this for time and clarity. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you, Bia. You mentioned in your private practice that you work with both across the spectrum of the DBH, HOH, and hearing populations. Do you utilize a hearing interpreter in your work with hearing clients? Or do you work with hearing people that sign or relay? Or how does that work from the other perspective?
Okay, thank you for this question. So my first language is French, so it actually happens to be easy for me to sit with hearing people. And we use spoken French, but it definitely uses up a lot of my energy when I'm having to speak and rely on lip reading some, but we can get by. When I'm here, there's a lot of English. I'm not accustomed to English every day, so it's even a bigger challenge for me. So that's when I would need an interpreter if it was a more English-speaking person or environment. I can sometimes get by, but I do use a microphone. It's a microphone that's kind of in the center of the room, and it can be connected to my cochlear implant. And it's closer to the client who's using their voice to communicate, and that makes communication easier for me. If it's a virtual therapy session, then my cochlear implant can be attached to the computer for a better audio, so that setup has been helpful for me. But for me, I'm okay. I have ways to make it work with hearing clients.
Merci.
You're welcome.
I mean, we have 1 minute left, so I don't think that's enough for questions. So anything else you want to close with? Do you want to ask for that, Bia?
Can you teach us a relevant thing to learn in sign language?
Oh, sure, yeah, I can do that. So Bia just asked for me to teach you all some basic sign language. I will do that. Ayahuasca, this is the sign for ayahuasca. Extend your index and pinky finger. Because of the vine, that is why we use and the DNA, that's why we use this particular sign. It's kind of shaped like the vine and the DNA. I don't know. Psychedelics, yes, I can show you the sign for psychedelics. This is the sign for psychedelics. Kind of like a wave. That's what it represents. It relates to visions that you'll experience. A sign for visions is this. It's like what you're seeing in your mind. Ceremony. This is the sign for ceremony. Mushrooms. Oh, you may know this sign. You probably already know the I love you. It's I, L, and Y all together to represent I love you. Very common for us to use in the deaf community. It's an easy way to express your love. Dreams. This is the sign for dreams. So. Any other requests? Oh, wow. Psychonaut? Ooh. I don't think there's been a sign created. Gonna have to create some. That is one of my goals here, to network and inspire the movement to involve deaf people and unite us all as one, and even just keep developing our view in the psychedelic work and therapy fields. So I don't want to do this alone. I'm seeking community. We have to involve more people to help this grow and thrive. Thank you.
Thank you so much.